Okay, so we're going to get started. I have no idea where everybody else is, but such is the light. So you guys know we have 2 weeks left, right? Are you stressed? You should be. Now would be the time to be stressed, okay? So I apologize that you haven't had me the whole semester because you got sidetracked and stuff didn't work. And I learned a lot last semester, or last class, about what skills you had and what skills you didn't have, and we had computer problems and whatever. So in the meantime, from last week to today, all these computers have Illustrator on them, so they're ready to roll. Today we have 2.5 hours left because we started late, and we need to have presentation boards by the end of today. So you guys don't have a lot of time left, so we're going to ram this down your throats, for lack of a better term. Okay? My goal today is to teach you how to do a presentation board. As was requested last class, I wrote up a walkthrough of exactly what I go through today with pictures, step by step. So if you've been in one of my 135 classes, you've seen my walkthroughs. It's like that. Okay? So you guys should be able to follow along. By next class, which is a week from today, which is 1 week before your actual due date, right? No, you guys are presenting to Autodesk the week after, right? Isn't that what it is, the 1st? Okay, so you have a little more time. June 1st is the one you're actually presenting. So you have a little bit more time. But my last time to instruct you is next Wednesday, and that will be when I'll teach you how to print and how to spray mount and how to actually create your final board that you're going to turn in. So it's important that you are ready for that. So between now and then, we need to finalize your designs. We need to get a final presentation going, etc. I'm okay. You don't have to actually do the spray mounting next Wednesday, but you need to have a pretty good idea of what's going on your graphic layouts and that sort of thing. I will demonstrate exactly how to print. I will demonstrate exactly how to mount it on a board. I'll demonstrate how to trim it off so it looks good, and so you'll be ready to go. Okay, that'll be next class. Today I'm going to go through kind of a sample board and kind of what works and what doesn't. But before I do that, I want to talk through, and I apologize my slides aren't working the way they're supposed to be, but I want to talk about some graphic layouts. And I pulled these off the internet, and you guys have a link in your, the Canvas site that points to a Google search of presentation boards. I don't know whether you've clicked on it or not, but it's pretty easy to type in Google, graphic presentation board. So I pulled up some of them, and I wanted to talk through kind of what's working and what's not working on these boards. And it's important to think about what's working and what's not working because you can learn a lot from what somebody else's presentation looks like. And so I didn't pick these because they were really good. I didn't pick them because they were really bad. I picked them because they were examples. And so as we look at this particular board, and I'm going to try to mouse over these if I can, and I might have to do it this way now. I hate it when my stuff doesn't work. Usually I can point on it live, but you guys are going to have to look at it the old-fashioned way. I'll point to the screen. So if we look at this graphic board, it's divided into 2 major parts. We have the upper section, which is the lighter colored section, and we have the lower section, which is the darker colored section. The presumption being that when you first look at this, you look at the upper section first. It gives us a couple views of whatever this bike computer thing is. Primary views. They've established this line here almost as a ground plane that runs across that lets the bike sit on the ground. And then below that, they have a bunch of exploded information about the thing. So in this case, our upper views are our primary grab your attention views. If you think about a graphic presentation, what's the purpose of it? Why do you do this in the first place? Exactly, to grab somebody's attention, to get them to look at your particular board. So you make something big and exciting and you grab their attention. That's the focal point. Then you work your way in and you start to look at more information with more detail. One of the things that I like to talk about in my 135 class is that when you're creating a presentation of some kind, you should be able to stand in the very back of the room, where I'm standing now, and look at the presentation and see something that's interesting. If you can see something that's interesting from here, it makes you want to take a couple steps closer. By the time you get to a couple steps closer, if you look at it, you should see something else that's interesting. You should then want to go a few more steps closer. Something else is interesting. And then we get all the way up in here to the final level of detail. And the idea here is that I want to be a foot or 6 inches away from your presentation board and still see something interesting. If I'm really far away and I see something interesting, but as I get closer, there isn't a progressive level of detail that makes me excited, I'll move on to something else. We're very, very quick when we go to judge these kinds of things. So it's that initial impression that's important, but then you have to carry it through the rest of the presentation. So we pull up another one. I like this one because we had some early marker sketches, which were emphasized in this class. And then we had some final renderings. And it's kind of a combination of the two, but it's really nicely laid out graphically. In this particular example, I don't know that they have one particular image that's the strong focal point, which I think you could make this a little bit stronger if you made one of those stronger. I would say maybe it's this one, their key sketch, because of the outline around it, kind of grabs your attention a little bit more. But this is fairly evenly weighted with the other pieces, the other primary pieces. So if I were doing this layout, I might change it a little bit so that one grabs your attention a little bit more than the others. You don't want to compete. You want to have a natural hierarchy in this. I think they did a nice job with their typography or their font choices. I think it's clean, and I think it's well conceived. There's also a clear hierarchy, big, smaller, smallest in this. And that helps read. And I want to emphasize that when you work through your drawings today. Another example here, I like this because it includes the exploded axon, which you guys may or may not do as part of your Fusion model. I'm not really sure. Fusion's not my area of expertise. But it's certainly something that you could do, which I think can look really nice as part of it. Again, it's pretty good in terms of the various font sizes and kind of how they work in conjunction with this overall scene. You have the very large, big rendering. I don't know why that's so much different than the other three renderings. They kind of compete a little bit. Maybe making those other ones a little bit more sketch-like would help because you want each thing to serve a purpose. But I really like the exploded axon. And part of the reason I like this exploded axon is because of these little details that talk about what's happening in various places. I think on any presentation board, when you have something that's complicated that can't read for itself, just in the drawing, having little labels is a good thing. And so in this case, they've done little labels. They've worked nicely to kind of identify what certain parts are and that sort of thing. And I would encourage you to do something similar to that. I absolutely can't stand the gradient sides. Okay, since I'm picking on things, that drives me nuts. It doesn't do anything for the presentation. It doesn't even really frame the presentation. It's just somebody getting excited about putting some gradients in. Don't do things like that arbitrarily because you think they're better. The person who designed this should have looked at it at the end and said, what do I need to edit out to make this cleaner? And that's one of the temptations. You add too much stuff in. Know when to call it quits and edit the stuff back out. Really like this one. It's clean. Doesn't have as much information on it, and it may or may not be a good example of a final presentation in one 24 by 36 board. The fact of the matter is this particular designer, Benjamin Lloyd, who I found online, again, I'm not super familiar with people that do industrial design, so I can't name people off the top of my head. But I found him online, and this was part of a series of maybe 6 or 7 boards that all went together. And if they're doing it as part of a series of boards, something like this that's one board could be really nice. And I think a couple things that are critical about it. One, the background is really nicely done. It's a subtle bit of shading. It's a subtle bit of gray. It gives us an idea that these objects exist in space, yet it's not overpowering. Do you guys remember way back they did those, Apple did those commercials with the I'm a Mac and I'm a PC? You guys remember those? Right? And they stood against the white background. And it was that kind of infinite plane of white background. These kinds of backgrounds work nice to cause you to focus on the object, not on the background. And so something like this is subtly done. If it's too dark, you focus too much on the background, and it's too doom and gloom. Something like this really accents the pieces nicely as part of this design. If we look at the composition of this, we have a really strong rule of thirds composition. So in that case, I would be taking my drawing. See if I can find a piece of chalk. This is the world's smallest piece of chalk. Right? So there's my 24 by 36. I take about a third of the way over. I take about a third of the way here. When I do this presentation, the key object happens right on the third line. It gives breathing space to the rest of this composition. Notice it's not centered. That's key as part of this layout. Then they have a other element that's on the third line that's over here. It's a little bit smaller. And then there's that nice little power cord that comes out toward the front to give it that perspective. This is really well laid out. Font choice is great. Colors are great. We could get into color theory about why they chose purple and orange, but purple and orange are nice complements of each other, and hence they work really well in this kind of a graphic presentation. The orange accent that's on each of these, plus the orange text, really unifies the group together from a color theory standpoint. So it's hard in a class like this because I have to refer to a lot of things that you should learn in other classes, like color theory is important. So you want to think about that. This is another example of the same group of presentation boards. So same product, different presentation board. You guys are stuck with one 24 by 36 sheet. Therefore, you have to fit all this stuff on one sheet instead of relying on multiple boards. But this is still nicely done. The orange carries through as part of the theme. The font carries through as part of the theme. And we have these two nice graphics that explode out the various pieces or the various components. We have a nice little key that identifies what they are. The only gripe that I have is the numbers themselves are a little awkward compared to the text. Somehow they just don't quite read right from a typographic standpoint. They either need to be smaller or they need to be aligned further down. They sit too high. There's just something about it that just doesn't quite feel right. And when you're looking at font choice and that sort of thing, the little details can really matter. And I'm sorry, Benjamin Lloyd, for picking on you. This is their concept sketches, marker sketches. And so if we can imagine all of these pieces coming together on one board, that's where you're going with these. We have the nice renderings, we have the concept sketches, and we're going to bring them into a final product. And I think this is working really nicely. It works similar to that first slide where we had the kind of the grayish background. In this case, it fades to white, but there's gray behind each of the marker drawings. The other thing that works really nicely in this is the extra square frame. So we have the extra square frame around those two rendered pieces, but instead of completely enclosing those two pieces in that square frame, we break the frame. So two of the elements come outside of the frame. It adds a three-dimensionality to this particular poster. So it's really nice. Just by adding that extra frame, we focus in on it. So it's another strategy to highlight this is the important drawing on your particular presentation board. I included this one because it was headphones. Seemed relevant. In this example, they have the one rendered view, and then they have a bunch of the little things that describe what's happening as part of it. I think this is a good exercise in the power of typography, and that you can use fonts and you can use text almost as well or better than you use the rendering itself. So you can use that as a graphic element and explain how these things work. This couldn't have been the final version because a bunch of things like this is true, not screw, like there's problems, but it's okay. The point is that if you have clean, good typography, those can exist as elements that help you describe your design, especially if your drawings or your renderings aren't quite as good. There's a way of combining them together to really make them look nice. So is there a scripted way of designing a presentation board? No, there isn't. If you look online, there's a bunch of examples like this that talk about how do you lay out particular pieces of work. We've talked about using the golden section before, or at least I've talked about it with a few of you. But how do you identify what happens in a page? Where's the primary point? And there's There's a variety of strategies. If I were to fall back on something, I would think about basic rules of composition. I talked about the rule of thirds. If you don't do anything else, the rule of thirds works really nice. Okay? Set something slightly off center, gives you some space to breathe on one side. You can put smaller elements in that space, and it reads really nice. If not, you could do something like this, which is actually a little bit rule of thirds in a way, where we have a focus area that's in the upper part, and then we have some subliminal areas to the right and to the left. Remember, we have a tendency to read from left to right across the page, starting at the top. Because of that, our natural desire to look at a page starts in that upper left corner. So if you have a strong element that brings you down, that can work in your favor. So it just depends on your particular pieces and how you want to set them up. This is the example that I'm going to go through today. It's a strategy that I use for portfolio design in my 135 class, trying to set things up as a quick way of identifying some key points as part of this particular project. You notice that in this, I have a line set up at about the rule of thirds. And so this can help you set up that point, but it can also set up some horizontal flow lines as part of your overall graphic presentation. So I'll walk you through today how do you create this to start, and then how do you start to align your elements based on something like this. So are there any questions before, and I know I'm rushing a little bit, but I have a lot to get through, so we have to kind of push. Are there any questions about these kinds of layout techniques that I briefly went over before we get into the technicals? Yeah. It gets a little bit into color theory and how well the colors go together with each other. It might be. I think you have to see what your presentation looks like. I think if you use color as a tool, it can be, if you think of it that way, it can help because you color something for a purpose. You color something because you want to draw attention to it. And that's separate and apart for, let's say I have 6 different, part of my speaker design or my earphone design is that you can pick from these 10 different colors, and I want to show those 10 different colors. If you're showing those 10 different colors as a ribbon on the bottom or something like that, it's kind of different. But if you're doing renderings, you may want to stick to one color or identify some specific piece in 1 or 2 colors or compatible colors because it lets you focus on that rather than get your eye distracted. So what you want is put the elements in, look at the overall presentation, and then is it too much? Are you being distracted? Are you being focused to the thing that you want, or is there too many colors and I'm scattered when I'm looking at it? The best thing is for somebody to look at it and want to get more information. That's the goal of this in the first place. That's a good question. So I wish there was a more scripted answer, but the truth is start to lay it out and we'll see.
What about different shades of the same color? I'm just asking this to identify on stage so I know that
I would say shades of the same color is a good strategy. If you're working within the same, unless you're trying to identify entirely different things. So shades of the same color, it's kind of like using grays. Right? If we think about grays, I know gray is not a color, but technically it is a color, especially if it's a warm gray or a cool gray. It's shaded one direction or the other. But you're using gradients to identify certain parts. Then if you put one pop of color in one place, you focus that attention on one pop of color that's different. So you can use one color scheme or one system of colors with one contrast, and that works really nice. So I think even if it was a series of oranges or something, it doesn't have to be grays, that series of colors works together as a unit versus one separate color. Hopefully that helps. As long as what you're trying to do is show that this piece goes together and not highlight something. Color is used to highlight for the most part. So let's look at yours specifically when we get going and we'll decide what's right. Okay. Well, then we'll talk about it next week when you get to that stage. Any other questions? No? Okay. So let me stop with the slides, and we're going to get into the actual setup here. So I had to do a sample so that you guys could see kind of an idea. And of course, right when I was getting the sample ready, this turned transparent. It was supposed to have a white background, but such is life. This is essentially what I'm going through, and I'm going to talk you through how I created it in the first place as an overall graphic piece. The truth is that if I were doing this like you guys were, I'd have more elements than I have. I'd have some sketches, I'd have more colored sketch drawings, maybe I'd have some different renderings, and you have to figure out how to fit those into your particular layout. I don't have as many pieces because I'm not you. I'm not doing this project. I'm just trying to show you the examples of it. So I'm going to start with a brand new Illustrator file, which is what you guys are going to do today. By the way, let me show you this. It'll be dependent on you. In general, I don't know what's common practice in an industrial design presentation like this. Generally speaking, in architecture, we choose not to put our names on things. So if I were doing it, I might put it on the back. I would also, if I wanted it to go on the front, I wouldn't be like Grant Adams in big text. I would put it down in the corner, small, subtle, something like that, which I think would be reasonable as part of it. So I wouldn't make it a key element. I would make it a subliminal element. So if we go to the Canvas site, what is it? DVC. It's hard. I don't use Canvas. I'm not used to this. Oh, come on here. There we go. So if you guys go here, I added some stuff. So this board layout tutorial link will take you to my digital tools site, which is where I actually posted the stuff. I didn't put any of it behind any kind of login, so you don't have to worry about it. But this is essentially everything that I'm going to go through today, and it will walk you through with these images everything that we talked through. I refer to certain other lectures and stuff that I think are relevant to what I'm talking about. And the point is that this is here so you can actually go back and see everything that I've done. And that's the idea, so that you don't have to try to take notes. Okay, so recognize that it's there for you guys to work with. So I will also, after I'm done today, I'll record. I'm recording right now, so I'll publish this and put it at the top so you can go back and see what I did in the order that I did. So it is there. I also updated on the Canvas site. These are the Prismacolor swatches. If you want to use any of those swatches, I told you I would give them to you. So they're there. You can download them. They're zip files. If you extract them, you can load them in as swatches in Illustrator and have the markers of all the colors of the Prismacolors to match what you're sketching with. So they are there if you want them as well. So let's get out of this. And let's get back to Illustrator here. I'm going to create a brand new 24 by 36 file. Let's go ahead and give it a name. This is what? ID121 final layout, something like that. And as I come down here, a couple things. One, you'll want to change your units to be in inches. And then once you've changed them to be in inches, you can come over here and change your width to be 36 and your height to be 24. Okay, so I have 36 and 24. Below that is something called bleed. And when you're printing at a print shop, chances are you'll print slightly larger, and then your drawing will be cut down to be the exact size. For what we're doing, it's not absolutely critical that we have bleed because we can't print full width stuff on the plotters here. So it's going to be shrunk to fit. It'll be slightly smaller than 24 by 36 when we actually go to print it anyway. But bleed is something that you should get used to if you're going to have things professionally printed. Usually 1/4 of an inch is reasonable. 1/8 of an inch works as well. The idea behind bleed is full color content that goes off the page has a little bit of extra content in case it's not quite cut correctly when you go to cut the final presentation board. So it's just a little bit of extra. Gives you some flexibility. So I set that at 1/4 inch all the way around. And then down here under advanced, Because we're going to be printing this particular document, we want to make sure that we're in a color mode of CMYK. That's cyan, magenta, yellow, and key or black. Those are the inks that are going to be used on this, so we want to be in that color space, not RGB. And we want to make sure that our raster effects are set at 300 ppi. And we do that because generally printers print at 300 ppi. So those settings being set are perfect. And then I'll go ahead and I will say OK. And that gives me a brand new 24 by 36 sheet to work with in Illustrator. The other thing about Illustrator, or at least I should point out, is that generally I would do layout work in InDesign. But for the nature of this particular class, you guys have only done Illustrator, so we're going to do our layout work in Illustrator. If you were going to do multiple presentation boards, multiple 24 by 36s, doing it in InDesign would be really, really useful. Doing a single board in Illustrator, yeah, it'll work. So we're going to do it in Illustrator. So I have this laid out. And the first thing that I want to do is I want to show my rulers so that I can see how big certain things are on the page. So I'm going to go to View, I'm going to go to Rulers, and I'm going to click on Show Rulers. I can press Control-R or Command-R on the Mac to show them as well. And that brings up these little rulers across the top of the page and down the side of the page. Furthermore, you see on the page, the white area is what my paper size is at 24 by 36. That bleed, that extra content, is the red line for cutting it off a little bit later on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw, or I'm going to pull a guide that goes from this ruler over toward the middle of the page. And this is going to give me a guideline for where the center of this page is. If I hold down the Shift key on the keyboard, it will jump to the individual little tick marks. And I can then really easily find where half of 36 would be, which would be 18, which is right here. And I can let go, and it gives me that nice blue line. That represents the first guide that kind of anchors my particular page. But before I go too much further, I'd like to be working on a layer called Guides. And right now, if I open my Layers window, which is available over here on the right side under Layers. Actually, let me reset this to be back to the Essentials workspace here. There we go, just so that it matches what you guys have. When I have my Layers window open, I have just Layer 1. I'm going to double-click on it and call it Guides for right now. And that way, I know that all my guides are going on this particular layer. Long term, I'm just going to turn it off. But for right now, things are going to go on the Guides layer. So now, I need to draw a few lines. So you guys have used the pen tool before. I don't need arcing lines. I just need straight lines. I'll use the pen tool, and I'm going to draw a line from this corner, right there, up to the center line, right there. I just click on that point, and I'll come back down to the other corner right there. Okay, so I've drawn that. And essentially what I'm trying to create here is what I showed you here in the presentation board, where we have this, we have the inverse of it, and then we have a diagonal that goes all the way across the page. So I'm going to come back to Illustrator. We'll do the inverse. We're going to go from this point. Oops, sorry. Go back to my arrow, click off, come back to my pen tool, and draw a separate line that goes from here down to the middle and back up to there. Now, I lost this part of the line because these shapes that I've drawn have a fill color associated with them. If I look over here at my fill color, it's white. So what I need to do is change the fill color to be transparent. And I'll select this one, change the fill color to be transparent there as well. So now I have this pattern established. The last piece of the puzzle is to go from this corner right there down to that corner right there. Okay? So once I have those lines established as kind of a base for my drawing, I can start to drag a few other lines across the page, much like I have. Go back here, here. So I've identified where a few of these points cross, and I've made those key points in my overall layout. So let me come back to my InDesign piece, or excuse me, my Illustrator piece, and I'm going to drag something to right there where those two cross. Notice that this is conveniently right at about 1/3 and 2/3. If I drew this line, this diagonal line here, if I drew it in the opposite way so that it came from this corner to there, I could establish the 1/3 line here instead of on that side. I'm doing it on the right here, because that happens to be kind of how I have laid out in my head. Last class, I asked a few of you to try doing some practice layout boards, and so you should have some idea as to whether it's going to be on the left side or on the right side, etc. So I have that already established. I'm going to go ahead and drag this line down to right there so that I see where those two lines cross. And then I'll come down here and I'll split the difference. I'll do an extra line. It's about halfway down from the page like that, so that these two are split. I can do it by eye. I could also hold down the Shift key. Notice that this is at 16, this is at 20, and this is at 24. They happen to be on the right track. Yeah? I don't need the line from the top right to the bottom left there, because I'm only identifying where this line would be. If I wanted this one, I could do it. In this case, I'm not going to worry about it. And that has to do with how I'm laying out my whole board. Okay? So once I have kind of these guides established, it's time to start thinking about the content and what I'm going to put on the page. And so I have the benefit here sitting in front of you, having already created the content. So it's easy for me to just say, oh, well, we'll just go get the content itself and we'll drop it in. You guys are in the process right now in Fusion of creating the renderings to begin with. So you obviously have to have a rendering before you can drop it in. But you want to think about, what do your elements look like and how do they fit on this page? Is the angle that you created as part of the rendering the right angle? So it took me several tries to get different renderings and figure out which one looked right. The one that I showed you last class that I was working with didn't really fit right with my layout. So I went back and I did a different rendering, and I chose that one. And so now it comes time to start bringing those pieces in. But I don't want to bring them in to the guides layer. I want to bring them into a content layer. So we'll create a new layer. I'm going to call this Middleground, for lack of a better term. And I'm going to bring in the content onto that Middleground layer. So I'm going to go ahead and go to File and then Place. And I'm going to go find my content. So let's see here. I'm going to use View 4. And I have here a version of my file that has no background. So at a risk of giving you too much information, I'm going to show you briefly the Photoshop file that goes with this. If I go to Open and I open the actual rendering, which is right here, that was the rendering that came out of the rendering engine. In this case, I used Rhino and V-Ray, so it was a V-Ray rendering. In your case, you'll use Fusion, and you'll get a Fusion rendering out of it. I chose to have it with a background so that I could have some reflections that were the kind of the sky tone reflections. But ultimately, what I need to have happen here is I need for the background to go away and become transparent and just keep the objects themselves. And I chose to keep the shadows as well. And so to do that, I did a layer from background, and then I created a mask, and essentially using a variety of techniques. Oops, let me paint in black here. I got rid of the background around my object. I'm not doing this particularly well, but you guys get the idea. All the way around my object so that it was a transparent object. Okay? And once that was done, I went to File and I said Save As. And when I did a Save As, I made sure that I picked PNG as my file type. PNGs preserve transparency. JPEGs will give you a white background again, which you don't want. So make sure it's a PNG. And if it asks you, you can do a PNG 24. It gives you a little bit more color depth. But a PNG file is what you want. What I ended up with, if I open it, is the no background version that looks like this. So essentially, I got rid of all the background pieces except for the shadows. so that this could live independently on my final presentation. And so that was a choice that I made. It gave me the flexibility to adjust my backdrop in Illustrator on my whole presentation rather than dropping in the image. There's a distinct difference when you drop in a file in Illustrator if it has a background. So if I went to File and then Place, and I dropped in the one with the background. Oops, it's a little big here. Let's cut it down here. And I stuck it on my final presentation. It exists as a square long term. So let me make this a little bit smaller here, something like that. It's always going to exist as that square. And then I have other elements, and they're going to be squares. So there's nothing wrong with doing a layout where you have a square after a square after a square. So it would be something like this page. Ah, thank you. Much easier. You know, I could set it up where I have image, you know, maybe a series of smaller images, and then a big image that's here, and maybe I have some text going across here. There's nothing wrong with this sort of thing, but it's very, like, everything is contained within its frame. It's not one big layout. And I think for products, a lot of times it's nice to show your product independent of a constrained rendered background. So that's why, in this particular example, I chose not to have a frame around my rendering, but instead make it transparent. So when I go to File and then Place, that's going to bring in my drawing. I'm going to pick the one without the background, which is right here. And I'll click Place. And that then drops it in with the transparent background, exactly what I wanted. And I'll hold down Shift, and I'll make this smaller. Notice that the file that came in was a lot bigger than my actual page size. That was on purpose because the rendering was big. It's always better to make things smaller than to try to make things larger. That's when they get blurry. So when I print it, I want it to be nice and crisp, so I make the rendering a little bit larger. So I'm going to zoom in here a little bit, Control-0 to zoom in, and I'm going to line up this big stack right on that 1/3 line. Potentially, you could argue that since this is the driving little piece, maybe it belongs on that as the focal point. I don't know. Right? You have to kind of think through what feels right as part of this design. Maybe I'll make this a little bit bigger so it gets closer to the top of the page. Maybe I'll get this a little bit bigger that way. Maybe like that. So now that exists as the first element in my page. Now I'll admit to when I set up this rendering, when I set this up in the first place, I was thinking about it existing on the right side of the page on my final presentation. So if you start to do the final presentation and you drop your rendering in and it just doesn't feel right, don't be afraid to go back and re-render it with a slightly different view such that it matches up with your final presentation. The nice thing about Illustrator is you're just placing a referenced file. So if you update that file, you change it a little bit, you just update the link, and everything is good. So now that I have this in place, I'm going to think about bringing in the other sketch-like object that I had. So I'll go to File, and that one, by the way, if I go to File, Open, I finished. It's slightly different than the one I did last time. It's right here. There it is. So that's like the sketched version of it. And I left a little bit of shadow behind and whatever. I did the width tool that I talked about last time to try to make it a little bit more sketch-like. I also did something to roughen up the lines just a little bit. And I should write up this so you guys can learn this process a little bit. Hold on one second. Let me just show you. You can take any curve that you've created, and you can go to the Effect menu. You can go to Distort and Transform, and you can go to Roughen, which will make it not so sharp anymore. It'll make it a little bit squiggly. You want to do, when you go through this, you're going to want to turn on preview so you can see what it does. For example, that's at 5%. It's real jagged, not what you wanted. I did it at, I think, 0.1%. So it's pretty subtle. And I adjust the detail level to maybe 20. And when you have preview on, you can kind of see how much it's doing and make those little slider adjustments. Gene, you had a question.
Yeah, so actually it's a bit off topic, but do you think it's better for us to do like hand-drawn drawings, or it's better for us to
It depends on how good you are at hand-drawn drawings. If your hand-drawn drawings are good, include those. If they're not, and your Illustrator drawings are better, include those. If they're equal, then look at which one looks best in your presentation. When you're doing the hand-drawn drawings initially, you're not thinking about the final presentation. You're just drawing. And so you either need to redo the hand-drawn drawings to match up with your presentation, or adjust your presentation to match up with your hand-drawn drawings. It's a little bit cart before the horse. Which one? I agree. I agree. If I had hand-drawn drawings of these, I would include them as part of it. You can use the same Photoshop techniques to isolate the hand-drawn drawings and get rid of the backgrounds. The other thing, if it's on white paper, you can always use a multiply blending mode to get rid of the background. In my final presentation, oops, hold on a second, that I'm working toward here, I actually had envisioned a bunch of hand-drawn sketches going across the top of the page right in here. I just don't have them, so I can't put them in. I didn't draw them. Right, you can. So we'll get through that. And again, I'm here. I'm a substitute. I don't have the sketches to put in, and I don't necessarily know what he told you either. So, but I do think it's a good idea to put those in, and I would encourage you to do that as part of it. And I can help you through that. Yeah. No, the school doesn't. You can, I think, you can sign up for a 30-day trial of Adobe Cloud and get Illustrator for 30 days, I think, for free. It includes Photoshop, too. If they also, as a student, have a price for you to subscribe to it monthly. So if you have your own laptop, you can subscribe for a certain amount a month and get it. So worst case is it would be, $20 for the month to have a month of it, and then you can terminate it. Yeah.
If you want to go a little old school, they have a CS2 for free, and it's basically the kind of same thing, just looks older. Photoshop CS2 and Illustrator CS2. This is the version. What's that? What are they on right now? Like 7?
Well, it's Creative Cloud. So they stopped at CS6 a couple years ago, and then they've had a few updates to the Creative Cloud. So it would be CS8 maybe, in real term. The truth is there's not much different with CS2. Well, CS3 was better than CS2, but I was in grad school when CS2 was out, and I did a lot of Illustrator work. Like, you could still do Illustrator, most of the stuff. Yeah.
They have keys that you just give out. Just go on to, just look up CS2 for free. And there's a tutorial on how to get it. No, and it's legal, too. They themselves gave out, like, master keys.
Yeah, so, I mean, the point being, you can get it out. Worst case is you can get the Creative Cloud for a monthly subscription, which is obviously what they want you to do. But the good news is it's a monthly thing instead of the old way you had to buy it for $400 or $500, and it would be, whatever. So. Sure, I'll do that. Okay, so you got to remind me after I'm done talking, and I'll put that stuff up there for you guys to use. Okay, so let me go back to here was my kind of final view of my kind of sketch view, so to speak. And I'm going to go ahead and place this one. So I'll go to File and then Save. And then I'll come back to my view here, and I'll go to File and then Place. And I'm going to drop that AI file right into this AI. There it is. So the nice thing, because it's Illustrator to Illustrator, you just take one file and you drop it into the other. So I need to make it a little bit bigger, and I need to figure out where it belongs. So let me zoom in a little bit. Let's get it down here at the bottom here. And I'm going to set this, let's see, so that the center of this would line up right on that center where those two pieces cross. And then I'll make this a little bit bigger. Maybe like that, as its own little graphic element, separate and apart from these drawings. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So, okay, so here's the inherent challenge. Obviously, I come in and I step in and I do it at a different pace. I do different things than what you guys have been doing. Ultimately, from my understanding, I'm grading what you're doing and giving you the final grade for it, for this particular piece. So that may or may not be a good thing, but it also means that I have the flexibility to adjust for your guys' individual scenarios, so it won't affect your grade so much. Does that make sense? The other part in this is you need to show as much as you feel is necessary to make your product shine. And I know that's a very annoying answer because it's not right and it's not wrong. But in your case, if you have a lot of little pieces, it's a matter of how do you assemble those little pieces around a good showcase piece that grabs your attention from the back of the room such that you have those layers of detail. I'm at a disadvantage on this because I don't have lots of little sketches. I don't have process sketches. I don't have product placement sketches because I don't have them. So in the example that I'm showing you, it's a couple big things and that's it. If I and when I go to print this, you're going to realize that it doesn't have a lot of content on it and it doesn't feel full enough by the time it's on a 24 by 36 board. If this was on an 8.5 by 11 sheet, it would feel great. Okay? So the fact that you have lots more elements is a good thing, and my guess is that they will belong, and when it goes on a 24 by 36 board, it will not feel so crowded with little elements as you think it does. Okay? So keep going with that. I will look at yours specifically today, and we'll talk through it and decide what feels right. But the key on lots of little things is that you still have that key focal grab your attention piece. Because if you don't have that, then it's just a presentation with lots of little things, and what's going to cause the Autodesk person in the back of the room to say, that's the product? Right? What's going to cause the executive to say, no, I want that one? It's the one when they're standing in the back of the room that grabs their attention. So you always have to make sure you have that kind of a focal piece. Okay? So we'll talk through yours specifically. That's the point of today to begin with. Okay, so I have those pieces installed on my layout here. The next part of this is to provide some kind of background. Obviously, it's on a stark white background, and one of the tricks that we as designers likes to employ is how do we show the background, how do we give it a little bit more flavor. If you look at some of the best graphic design pieces, they always have some kind of a background, some kind of a context in which this product is really showing nicely. So one of the latest obsessions or trends certainly in the world of architecture, and I would suspect it's going to spill over if it hasn't already into product design, is to have some kind of textured background dirt. And one of the things that I like to talk about in my 135 class is take Pixar, for example. Okay, big render animation studio. Do you know there's a person that sits at Pixar whose sole job it is to make things dirty? That's all they do, is they make things dirty. So that when you're watching Toy Story, things don't feel so perfect because real world things aren't perfect. They never are. So by adding textures, we add a certain realism to it. Even though it's totally fake and it's not there, there's just a certain quality that makes you attracted to it. And so this type of texture is called a grunge texture. And so I'm going to go ahead and put a grunge texture on the background of this using a variety of strategies that are, by the way, written out. And I point to them right here. There's custom background texture and background texture. This will walk you through exactly how you do this sort of background texture. So it's there. You can link to it and see it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Illustrator. So yes, on the Canvas site right here, under the Autodesk presentation boards, there is a board layout tutorial link, which takes you to my digital tool site, which is what my 135 and 136 students use. And then inside of there are all the individual links to various lectures and whatever that I think are relevant for this. So I'm going to go back to my Illustrator file here, maybe. There it is. And I'm going to go ahead and draw. Actually, before I do that, let me create a layer called background. So I'll rename it background. And I'm going to drop the background layer down below the middle ground. It would make sense for it to be lower in the layer stack, so I'm going to make sure it's there as well. And on that background layer, I'm going to draw a rectangle. And I'm going to fill that rectangle with kind of a medium gray color. I'll go ahead and say OK. And then I will draw a rectangle that's as large as my page. Say something like that. So it fills in my page. Now I want to do some kind of grunge texture on the background of this. And I do that through the transparency window, which looks like two overlapping circles here. And so I have the object selected. We see it right here, that gray square. And I'm going to click on this Make Mask button. And when I click on that Make Mask button, my object goes away, and I get a black mask. This works a lot like the Photoshop masks do. If you've worked in Photoshop and you've worked with masks in Photoshop, this is exactly what we're doing, except it's in Illustrator. Now what I'll do on the mask, I'm going to actually click on the mask itself. You see it highlights in orange right there. I will go up and I'll go to File and then Place, and I'm going to drop in a grunge texture. And you can do a Google search very easily for grunge textures. I have a file on my flash drive that saves a bunch of grunge textures. The one that I was going to pick is this retro background texture. I liked it. But if you do a Google search, actually the best place to do it would be a Creative Commons search, which is search.creativecommons.org. And we will search for grunge texture. The advantage of using a Creative Commons search is that when you do that, these are all textures that people have licensed you to use. So as long as you credit them, you can use them. And so you can find one that feels right. So I'm going to go back to Illustrator now. And on that, I'm going to go ahead and place this retro background texture. Like that. And you see that it then drops a texture behind my overall scene. Now sometimes this texture ends up being a little bit too strong. It takes away too much of the drawing itself. If that's the case, we can drop the opacity value down. We could say maybe 30%, and we get much less opacity. Furthermore, if this edge is a little bit lighter than that edge, I can transform by rotating this all the way around so that one edge is different than the other. I can also move one edge over and decide at what kind of level I want this to be. Something like that.
And how do you credit somebody else's work on the back of your board?
I'd put it on the back myself. And so in this particular case,
And then how do you do it exactly? Their name and then
yeah, you would say there's actually some specific text about how do you use Creative Commons images and how you're supposed to link to it. Most of the time, it's an online link. You post something online, you put the link to where you got it, essentially. I would say on the back of this, background texture courtesy of, and then whatever the person's name was on Flickr. So in this case, I was looking for Flickr. If I use this particular one, I would say background image courtesy of Anna Irving, something like that. Yeah, something like that. If it was actually posted online, you would need to put a link to this person's page. That's how Creative Commons works. The point is, and the reason that you have Creative Commons, and you can get into this, it's a whole separate topic, is you can talk about how these things work. So you can adapt, etc. Right? And the reason that you use these is because they can't say, you used it and I'm suing you and whatever. Okay? For the most part, people that put stuff up like this, they want you to use it. They're happy that you're using it. Now, if you're reselling it or you're using it for commercial purposes, it might be different because you're selling it. Like if you made an art print and then you started selling that art print to people, okay, that's beyond the purpose of what this is. For you guys, you're a student. In 10 years of teaching, I've only had one complaint for copyright infringement when somebody used something that somebody created that actually wasn't Creative Commons licensed. I have never once had a complaint for anything that anybody's ever done that was Creative Commons licensed, because generally people understand you're students and you're trying to improve your work. Okay? So I wouldn't overly worry about it. Okay. So back we go into the world of Illustrator. There it is. And so I have that background texture. I dropped it down to about 40%. Feels pretty good. I'm happy. The only thing is, over here in my sketch, too much of the background is kind of showing through the sketch. So I'd like to kind of give myself a little bit more white behind this particular object. So I'm going to go into my layer stack. Oh, wait. I'm going to go back to my transparency. To get out of the mask, I have to click over here to get back into my main document. That's the one place that people get stuck in opacity and transparency masks in Illustrator, is that they don't click back to get into their document. When I do that, I get back to my normal layers. So on the background layer, on top of this object, I'm going to create another object. So I'll be on the background layer. I'm going to create another object. And this object is going to go from about there to about there. And on this object, I want it to go from being white at this edge to being transparent at this edge. And so I'm going to use the gradient tool, which is right here. Sorry, right here. And I want to have the gradient go from being white to being transparent at this end. So if I click on the gradient tool, we have white to black. That's not what I wanted. So I will go to my swatches, and I need to pull this out here so that I can see it at the same time as my gradient, right there. And I'm going to drag the none swatch right over here into my gradient. Apparently I'm not. Sorry, my bad. That was the way you probably did it in CS2. If I double click on the black, I can change the opacity value to be 0. That's what I should have done. And so now I go from white on this edge to over here, it's transparent. And so there's some fine line in the middle where I might want to maybe pull this over a little bit. Oops, hold on. I lost my selection. I might want to pull this over a little bit so that the transparency occurs after my drawing. So I'm taking my texture and making it not apply underneath this part of the drawing so that that shows better as a drawing. Does that make sense? So I'm thinking about what pieces look better with texture behind and what pieces don't. And maybe that's the way I want it long term, maybe not. I'm trying these things out, and I can always turn them off if I don't like them. That's the advantage. So that's there right now and causing that little bit of transparency. It's a little bit too strong, and it's bugging me. So let me go back and pull this back a little bit more. Yeah, we'll go right about like that. The other thing that we can do is we can change the blending mode of that piece of transparency, and we can change it to maybe overlay. That make a slight difference in terms of how they combine. Okay, so I have that piece installed. I have a little bit of the texture coming through, but it's feeling a little bit more like a nice drawing. Now it's time to go ahead and add some text. So I'm going to go ahead and do the text on the background layer. So let me come down here. I'm going to go to the background layer, and I'm going to go ahead and click the type tool. And I'm going to create text that fits down here in this lower section. We'll say maybe about like that. And when I do text, I really want to think about what font I'm using, because font and typography choice really matter in the overall scheme of things. So what you're doing, think about font choice. For me on a Mac, I tend to open up something called Font Book. You guys don't have the same thing on a PC, but it lets me go through and see which fonts I like and which fonts I have installed on a computer, and I can then say, oh, I really want to use, you know, the Alex Brush font or the whatever, you know, Birch. Whatever, you get the idea. Right, one of these is good. The one I'm going to use is League Gothic because I think it works fairly well for what I'm doing. So I'll change my font to League Gothic. League Gothic, by the way, is a free font that you can download. If you do a search for it, you can find it. And I know that my size needs to be a whole lot bigger than it is right now. So maybe I'll do my size at 450 point or something like that because I want the text to be its own kind of element. And then we'll go ahead and start typing. And apparently that font was too big. Let's try 350. There you go. And so I'm calling mine either, I can't decide what I want to call it. It's going to be speaker mesh or it's going to be speaker, what was the other one? Swarm. Something like that. And I'm doing the split case as it sets up. So let me select that, and then let's go ahead and change that size up. I think it needs to be more like 350. And I'm going to let this live as its own element down here at the bottom. And I kind of want parts of the letters to get clipped off when I end up cutting them because I want it to kind of exist as its own element. It's really strong right now in this context. But if I drag the text below the rest of what's going on here, it becomes much less strong. Furthermore, I could take the text itself. Oops. Sorry, hold on. Let me lock these two so I don't select them. I could take the text that's, hold on, I'm still in isolation mode. There we go. That needs to be below those. Those two are locked. There we go. I could take the text itself, instead of making it black, I could drop that down to be more of a gray, and then less of it's showing. So there's some combination that feels right as part of this, so that it's not overly intense, but it's also a little bit of extra text. And you guys probably need to put something on there about this is the Autodesk Design Challenge. So let me go ahead and drop that over here. Let me do that in caps again. It's up to you. If you want to put it on the back, you can. Yeah. Quarter of an inch is the overall size. But if you do 24 by 36 as your size and then set the bleed, it will be outside of the 24 by 36. It's meant to be outside of it. So your document is still 24 by 36. OK, so let me go ahead and take this, and I'm going to drop this size down. We'll say this is maybe 150. And well, this is the Autodesk Design Challenge, and this is audio. What's it called? Audio something? I know, but I think it's called Audio Tech or something like that. I don't know. It doesn't matter. And we'll go ahead, and I'm going to rotate this like that so that it goes up this side. And let me zoom out a little bit. Still way too long. Let's take that and drop it down in size. And we'll run it along that side or something like that. I'll take that text there, and once again, I'm going to put it below the other objects. Let's put it there. And let's put this below those other objects so it's not quite so strong. And now that shows up on one side. It might be something that you want to do. You might want to put the Autodesk logo on it. It's kind of a matter of what feels right to you as part of it. Let me press Control-0 to go back to this particular board. So as I start to develop this, right, I have the text that's been installed. I have the rendered image. If I had sketches, I think I would put them along here, along the upper edge. Maybe the sketches would take the place of the text. Maybe the text really should be the opposite. Maybe it should be on top. And this is one of the things about InDesign is you play around with options. So let me copy this. And I'm going to edit, paste in front like that. And I'm going to take this text and I'm going to drop it all the way at the very top of everything. Let's put it there. It's at the top. Let's make a foreground layer. And let's put that on the foreground layer. Let's make that text, instead of being gray, let's make it white. And so maybe it's the inverse. Maybe it just is cut out of the background. It's much more subtle that way. You have to play around with what the right option is for you. Okay? So just another example there. In this particular case, I think I'd put sketches along here. Maybe I'd put sketches along the bottom and take away the text. I don't know what the right strategy is, but it's, again, dependent on what content you have. The other thing that can be useful is to add in little text blurbs that explain what's happening in various pieces of your design. Maybe you want this to have more colorization to it. And I thought I had a layer on this that had the color on it. What happened? I did, but I had this one set up with that. I don't know what I did. Bear with me for just a second. Trying to figure out what I did. I think somehow I lost part of my drawing. Yeah. Well, this kind of stuff does happen. I'll show you. Here was the version. Come down here. Here's the version. Oh, come on. Of course, it's not going to let me zoom in. There's the version that was colored. Okay, so I toned in the various pieces, and that helped to have it stand out just a little bit. I have no idea what happened to it. I'll have to find it. But I added, on this particular version, I added little bits of text along here that describe various pieces of what was happening. And I think a lot of times it's helpful to put little pieces of text. So I would encourage you to do something similar to that. Let me go back to this particular view, and I'll go to my text tool. And so if I was identifying this, for example, I might draw a little piece of text. Let me make it have a black line. But I can also, on this line, I can choose to, under the stroke menu, I can choose to have an arrow, or what I like to use, a dot on one end. And so I'm doing that at the start. And if we look at this and zoom in a bit, you can see that that has a line with a little black dot that points to it. It's kind of nice. And so maybe the thickness needs to be a little bit more, something like that. Then it's a matter of coming in with my text. And like I did last time, I used League Gothic. So let's make this small. Let's maybe 24 point. And I'll say, and let me do something a little bit smaller on the next. So I create a hierarchy, and maybe this is right? Maybe I add something funny as part of it. Go ahead, just try to scratch and dent it. I don't know, right? You guys have seen some companies believe in little bits of humor. Anybody have Yetis like this? No? These are like amazing, okay? But if you look at the packaging, it's really funny. Like they have lots of little goofy things that they put in the packaging. That can be a way of getting somebody's attention. Again, that is the level of detail when you're right up close to something that you suddenly see and get a kick out of. It's not something that you see from the back of the room. It's that extra layer that's close up. So maybe you do something like that. Maybe you don't. I don't know. It's up to you. It's about your personality. Once I have these two pieces put together, let me drop this down a little bit like that. I'm going to select both, press Control-G to group them together, and then I can copy and I can paste it, and I can come down here, and maybe this one describes the magnetic and I might say something like if I can type, right? Group them together or stick them anywhere, whatever, okay? The point is that I'm identifying key parts of this design process, and I'm using these as I go down. So I have this one. Maybe I need to, once again, let me get out of the group. I need to take this, Control-C, Control-V to give me another one. We'll pull it down, and now I'm going to say that this one, you know, is the universal play button, or whatever. You get the idea, right? I'm putting these little things on. You may find in this that you want to align things so that they line up correctly. If you do that and you select multiples by holding Shift, if you click one more time on one of the objects, it will highlight. That's the key object that you can then center the rest of the objects on to make sure that they all line up in a stack. Okay? So we go through and we make those little bits of labels. Let me press Control-0, and it's starting to evolve as part of the drawing, part of the overall background, etc. One of the things that I felt this needed was the idea that this was a mesh network, so I wanted to do some kind of a drawing that represented the mesh network. I know I'm running out of time, and you guys need to start working, so I'm not going to go too much more. But if I go back to my original here, I decided to do this little pattern with these various units interconnected by these lines. The idea is that, and I'm making this stuff up, right? The idea is you have a base speaker, and then you can have 30 of these little speakers and put them wherever you want. And it works as a mesh, and they all communicate with each other, and you can have sound everywhere. I don't know. I made this stuff up. I don't know. It sounded cool. Whatever. Right. I'm just adapting it. We'll call it a swarm if it's better than a mesh network for you. Whatever. The point is, this was my concept. I don't know. I had to come up with something. It's probably not the best, but whatever. And so I wanted to do that kind of interconnectivity, so I started at the base of this particular piece and then started to draw out. Maybe in its final version, there'd be little sketches that occurred at these various points. I don't know yet. Right? I'm still evolving this as a design concept. But I wanted those kind of as a background as part of this particular graphic. The other thing to think about is once you start to create these pieces, maybe they're too strong, maybe they're too bold, maybe they're too dense, maybe they're not dense enough. You have to kind of go through and edit each time you go through it. So once you get to a final version, you take a quick look at it. Does it look right? Maybe you print a test version. Remember, printing here is really cheap. You can plot to one of the plotters for 25 cents on cheap paper. You do a plot. You see, what does it look like at 24 by 36? Does it look good? Does it not look good? Right? We may, next class, I may have you just print 24 by 36s to see where you are. It's not a bad idea. Yeah? I don't know, but we will find out. Well, anything that's outside of this. So, for example, let's see here. Like these circles, see how they're going off the page, right? That will automatically get clipped when I go to print. So it'll get cut off when I do the printing. So anything that extends beyond, I'm just assuming is going to get cut off. Right. If that was your strategy as part of the layout, sure. Sure. So you have to kind of think through what feels right. What I was trying to do in today's lecture was give you a bunch of strategies for how this stuff actually would come together that's different from let me just set up a board and drop pictures in. Okay? So what I want you to try to do today is evaluate the remaining hour and a half, how much time you have, think about where you're going with this particular project, and start to come up with what this is going to look like in its final presentation. I don't want you to waste your time. I want you to use it to the best of your abilities because you don't have a lot left. Okay? We will continue. I'm not exactly sure what I'll talk about next week. I know I will talk about printing and spray mounting and doing the final board, but I'm not exactly sure how much of this I'll go into. One of the things that I do want to make sure that we have time for over the rest of today and next class is that if any of you have something that you want to show me, we can critique it, we can make it a little bit better, and that sort of thing. Okay, so please come get me and say, let's look at it. But I also want to give you time to work because you need time to work. Are there any questions? It's probably a dangerous thing to ask, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Let me see. Hold on. Yes. So add appropriate background imagery using compositional strategies. Yeah, how nice, right? So sorry. Sometimes you just kind of, just do it, right? So what I did is I stripped away the primary content for a second. Let me go back to here. And let me take away. I went back to just where I had just the guides. So I went back to that page, and I said, okay, I'm going to create some circles. And I went here. Let me create a new layer for this. And I said, okay, I'm going to create some circles. I'll go in here, and I'll go to the ellipse tool, which creates the circles in the first place. And I'll single click, and I'll type in a value. And I said, I don't know, maybe 4 inches. Oops, sorry. 4 inches and 4 inches. And I said, okay. All right, so there's a 4-inch circle. I wanted to make sure that it had no fill. There it is as a 4-inch circle. Then I said, well, maybe let me do a 5-inch circle. So 5 inches and 5 inches. And let me do a circle that's a little bit bigger. Let's do maybe 6.5 and 6.5. And I said, okay. So now I have those 3 circles. I'll select those 3 circles. Oops. I'm holding down Shift. I'll pick this one as my key circle. And then I'll use my alignment tools to align to the center and to the center. Oops. Center and center. There we go. And then I made those a group. So I went Control-G to make them a group. And now, oops. Control-G should make them a group. Now they're a group. And then I said, okay, let me copy this and let me paste it. And I'm going to put each of these at the center of one of these little lines. That was how I set them up. And I went Control-V and I put it maybe there. And I said, okay, let's put one up over maybe there. And let's put one there. And let's take this one and move it to that point. Actually, I ended up moving this one down to match up with where the center of that speaker was. So once I had those, then I said, well, wait a minute, I need to make these a little bit larger. So I just went and I dragged these a little bit larger and then repositioned them. And this was really by eye in terms of what felt right. Which one should be large, which one should be small. That one maybe is a little bit smaller. That goes there. This one needed to be a little bit smaller. Well, these ones, in this particular case, these were designed to be subliminal elements. They were behind everything else. And so I didn't want them to be too dramatic. I just wanted them to have some indication of what the network was or the mesh was, and the fact that they were interconnected. So I didn't focus too much on the biggest being the primary focus. It was more about the other elements. These ones were the primary focus, and these were information that was in the back. Looks like I didn't position this one correctly. This one went down over here, like that. And so those elements just kind of went to the background and became other elements. I only started to work with those after I had positioned the other pieces. So it was really visual at that point as to which one should be bigger, which one should be smaller, and which one felt right. And that gives you different examples. So this set was a little bit different than the set that I did before. And again, it was just visual as to which one felt right. Anything else? No? OK. So you have another hour and 15 minutes or so to work. I would encourage you to use that time wisely. I have the laptops here. When you're done with the laptops, we have to make sure they all power off. And if you don't power them off, then I have to do it. And I'll get in trouble if I don't. So number one, you have to give me the laptop back. And number two, you have to power it off. So we'll go through that. OK? Is there anything else? I don't think so. So I will do the post-processing on this. I'll put this video in front of the walkthrough so that we can go. You guys can go back and see what I did when you can't find me again until next week. Okay. I am here on Mondays during the day. My other two classes are from 8 to 2. So if you want to talk to me on Monday, come find me then, and we'll go through stuff if you want. All right. Nope.
Will you upload this video to your website?
Yes. Yes, I'm going to. If I can figure out how to stop it from recording.